We're in an early model JK with a L86 8-speed. This is an early model L86 8-speed versus a later. Basically, there was a split in about 2017 where GM updated the fuel system. They went to a fuel rail sensor that had 3 wires instead of 4, and that's how you can identify your engine if it's an early or a late. It's on the driver's side rear fuel rail. And the 3-wire sensor, while you think it has less wires, actually is more sophisticated. It's actually a serial device. It actually sends, I believe, 4 signals through those 3 wires using a serial network. In any event, the L86, as most of you know, is a great engine and the cousin to the LT1. They're a very similar engine. Things have changed recently, and that's why we'll talk about it. In the early days, back in 2016, most of our LT builds were L86s and L83s, and the reason was they were available at an affordable price. Now, when I say affordable, the first L86 I bought, I think, was $9,000 just for the engine, and the first L83 I bought was about $6,000 because that's what they were going for. They were very scarce and there weren't a whole lot of them available. With the propagation of the LT1, demand for the L86 has dropped somewhat, and let me explain. 3-4 years ago, we could pick up low mileage L86s for $4,000 or $5,000. New LT1s in a crate were over $10,000. So the choice was pretty clear. We would buy the L86s, and in some cases we'd install the LT1 intakes, and we had virtually an identical engine. Now, there are some differences between the LT1 and the L86. The LT1 does not run a vacuum pump for the brakes. It uses manifold vacuum. The L86 does run a vacuum pump. They both work just fine. I am a big fan of the vacuum pump because as long as that engine's turning, you have vacuum, where most of you with the Pentstars or even the 3.8s know if you lose engine vacuum because you're revving it up excessively, you can lose your brake assist. Although with the Pentstars, they did install the electric motor. Now, the early operating systems, and I'm going to call the early operating systems 14 to 16, definitely had some teething issues. They mostly with the transmission. The engines had a couple of upgrades for active fuel management and oiling, but the transmission, especially the 8-speed, was really where most of the issues were, and it was software related in most cases. We have replaced a couple of 8L90s because of hardware, but that's very rare. And GM has consistently improved those. And what I find with the early LTs is that they take a long time to learn or adapt. And there's adaptives for almost everything these days. Fuel adaptives, spark adaptives, shifting. And you can do quick learns and all sorts of other things to make the transmission shift right. But the early 8L90 especially was challenging to get shift exactly the way you want it. In 2017, GM revamped the engine controller. They went to a T87A, and all I can say is that the later model 8L90s and 10L80s are a breeze to get to shift right versus the early ones. That doesn't mean the early ones don't work. They do. I'm driving an early one right now. Once you get them to work right, they work excellent. So between the fuel system and the transmission control, the early LTs separated themselves from the late LTs. Can you update a early LT engine and run a late model transmission? Yes, you can. You can replace the fuel pressure sensor in the back and the sub harness under the intake, and then run a later model transmission. And we do that quite often because we think that works better than sticking with the early model operating system. And that's very similar to what I did with the LSs. If you had a 7, 8, or 9, let's say an L92 or an early L9H, you could update the map sensor and oil pressure sensor and then run the late model operating system with a late model 6L80, which was an easier transmission to work with than the early 6L80s. So history has repeated itself with the LT in regards to the transmission control, just like the early LSs. Unfortunately, just like some of the early builds, we're getting customers mixing and matching parts. And a lot of the time it's not their fault, it's a wrecking yard's fault. They'll buy a 2015 8L90 because it's got a good price, and then a 2018 or 19 L86 or L83. Well, technically that combination is not compatible. Yes, of course we can make it work, but it's not preferred. So we'll talk about the L83 in another video. We'll also talk about the L84 and the L87 because they are an evolutionary step of the L83 and the L86 running the dynamic fuel management, but we'll save that for another video. So if you get an L86, you get a different accessory drive than the LT1, which is the accessory drive we run. And we run it because it lays out better and it's more readily available. We actually do have a drive for the LT1, but GM was on back order and a lot of the bracketry and it was just more difficult to get parts, so we stuck with the balancer and the water pump from the truck. We offer several power steering brackets for the LTs, whether you're running a PSC pump or a factory JK pump, and we even have some brackets for the LT4 and soon to come the LT5. So what's the big difference then between the L86 and the LT1? We already talked about the vacuum pump. The oil pan is different. The LT1 has a different oil cooler outlet. It's much larger, and if you want to run an external oil cooler, a little bit more expensive than the L86. The L86 has the old steel lines, just like the L96 and the earlier LSs, where the LT1 has essentially a large flat plate that goes to a cooler that GM installs on the LT1 from the factory. So if you want to run an external cooler using AN fittings, it's just a little more expensive, but it's not a big deal. Where we really get into the differences is in the top end. The LT1 has a low intake, obviously, for the Corvette and the Camaro. You can buy an LT1 intake with all the parts that go along with it, which include an isolator and covers and things, and I think it's $400 or $500 for the whole deal from GM, bolted on your L86, and it'll look just like an LT1. Performance is virtually the same. A lot of guys say that the truck has more torque and the LT1 has more horsepower and all this, and that's probably true, but when I drive them, they all feel pretty much the same to me. A big advantage of the LT1 and the JK, especially the early JK, is clearance. The intake gives you a lot more clearance to the firewall, fender wells, etc. Guys, we are offering a battery tray now that Motec manufactures in-house, and it turns the battery sideways and puts it up against the fender well. You don't have to run it. You can run our LS or LT conversions without that battery tray. But the battery tray does a couple of things. We put bounce on it for things like the heater hoses. It definitely gives you more clearance to the valve cover, probably 4 to 6 inches in most cases. The early JK and the late JK have different battery trays, as you know, because the Pentastar engine is wider than the 3.8. The old 60-degree 3.8, being a narrow engine, Chrysler made a narrow tunnel and extended the battery tray further into the bay. When they went to the Pentastar engine, they widened the tunnel and turned the battery sideways and gave it more room in the battery area too. So the late model JKs are easier to fit an L86 in. And I say L86 because the L83 has a smaller intake than the L86. The LT1 has a much smaller intake than the L86. The L86 just has a large intake. So if you stuff it into an early JK, it's going to be tight. We find running a 1-inch or 1.5-inch body lift gives you plenty of clearance with the L86. And we've also run them without the body lift, of course, but you got to really be careful about all your clearances to the hood and the firewall and all that. And I don't know how to explain it, but we can do 2 identical JKs, like 2008s with L86s. One you can get your hand behind the intake, and the other one you can't. I think it's just build tolerances. You can shift the body around and you can do things to get more clearance, but at the end of the day, if you really want to get a lot of clearance, just go with the LT1 intake. Now here's where things get somewhat muddy between the L86 and the LT1. As mentioned, the LT1 used to be a $10,000+ engine, and then it went down to $9,000. Then it went down to $8,000. The whole time, the L86 is kind of holding its price up. You know, that $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 used engine price on an L86 is still there. And if you want a really low mileage L86 in great shape, you're going to pay $5,000, $6,000. Now, yeah, you can pick up an L86 for $4,000 or $5,000 with a transmission, but I warn you that I've had customers do that and get burned. So if you really want a high quality engine, get it from a trusted source that gives you a warranty. But this is what it comes down to. Let's say you spend $5,500 or $6,000 for a used L86. For an extra $1,500, $1,000, depending on where you source your LT1 from, you can get a brand new crate LT1 and have the GM warranty with it and all that. So what's happened is supply and demand has changed to the point now where there's a gray area between purchasing a used L86 and a new LT1. The advantage of the LT1 obviously is it's going to be new, it's going to have the GM warranty, and the new LT1s are just built solid. I haven't had any issues with the new LT1s. They're just awesome, awesome engines. So it's going to be a new crate engine. It's going to have the LT1 style oil pan, and you can get the dry sump if you want. On the crate LT1, you will have to change the water pump and balancer out because they are set up for a Corvette, which has a different offset. And we use the truck water pump and balancer to work with our power steering pump. The rest of the drive is all stock. The alternator, the air compressor, tensioner, it's all stock GM. Now this is really important. We discussed that in 2017. Between 16 and 17, GM changed the operating system and some of the sensors, the fuel system, the transmission control module in these LTs. I highly recommend you get a later model setup if you can find one. So I recommend if you get the LT1 crate engine that you get a 17, 18, or 19 transmission. And again, there's a caveat there. And this is all the stuff that we had to learn with the LS, and now we're learning with the LT. The 17, 18, and 19 8L90s and 10L80s in general run the T87A controller. In late 19, when they came out with a new body style vehicle and they introduced the L87 and the L84, they switched to a T93 transmission controller, and there's not good support for that controller. So you don't want to buy a later model 10L80. And one of the things that we've noticed is the new body style 10L80s that run with the L83 and the L87 have no drain plug. And to back up on that, the way you basically fill these transmissions up is you pull this drain plug out the pan. There's a tube sticking up, just like Jaguar and everybody else have been doing for years, and you fill the transmission up until it overflows into that tube, and then you let the fluid normalize at operating temperature, of course, and that's your fluid level. Now in the 8L90, we installed a dipstick tube and we mark it for full, which is very convenient. The 10L80 does not have a big port to put a dipstick tube. The later model 10L80s that don't have the drain plug use a cap screw, something that looks like a cap screw in the back of the, it's above the oil pan in the casing, and you basically pull that cap screw out and fill it the same way. You just don't have the tube. So I know this is a lot of information to digest, but here's the deal. If you're trying to decide between an L86 and an LT1, just know that the price differential is not that much anymore. It's maybe $1,500 in today's money. The L86 has the vacuum pump, which works excellent. One consideration there is if you have a PSC big bore box, then you're probably not going to be able to run the vacuum pump. You'll have to plug it off. So the LT1 might work better in that situation. The LT1 offers better clearance, especially in the early JKs where you have the narrow tunnel. Then you have to decide whether you want the early operating system or the late operating system. And I can tell you, I got some early operating systems, even 14s and 15s, that run just excellent. They shift just as good and run just as good as the late model Jeeps. The difference is the amount of work you have to put into it to get it to that point. So if you find a smoking deal on a 15, 8L90, L86, don't be afraid to get it. Yes, you might have to do a little bit more tuning and programming and updating. One of the things you might want to do is get the VIN number and call GM, because there were some recalls, like I said, on hardware, especially for the active fuel management in the early engines. It was about 17 they had that sorted out, maybe late 16. To finish this video, I will say, once you drive an LT62, whether it's an LT1 or an L86 with an 8-speed or a 10-speed and a direct injection, it's really like nothing else out there. You can drive Hemis and you can drive LSs and superchargers. It's just not like anything else out there. So we're going to take this L86 up to the mountain, and we will see you soon. I've got a ton of builds in the shop. We got LT5s and L87s and hot rod engines with cams, and stay tuned.